Hello, scholars. My name is Ira McIntosh, and this is Hypothesis. Hey everyone, welcome back to my office for another episode of Hypothesis. Today's episode is really exciting to me because I get to talk about something that I've never really considered before, but somehow ended up playing directly into some of the things that I myself am researching. So I hope that this topic is something that you will find just as engaging and fascinating as I did. And come along for this journey. We talked about the art of decay and how different artists are using the concept of decay and death in their artwork. We talked about museum curation, specifically museums that are outdoors. So, plant based artworks and things that use landscapes as part of the art and sculpture as the art. And how the outdoor elements affect that artwork. And then we also talk about queer expression in gardening, which I guess is something that I have sort of on the periphery known about, but never really got to dig into. So my guest really got to teach me more about this topic, and it was really fascinating, really exciting to learn more about things that I study through a new lens. So my guest today is Ellie Botoman. And Ellie Botoman is an art historian, museum worker, and freelance critic based in Brooklyn. Their interdisciplinary research practice explores environmental art and architecture, multi-species design, and how climate change impacts cultural institutions and heritage preservation. They recently completed their master's at New York University's Experimental Humanities program and will embark on a PhD in art history at City University, New York. This is also very exciting to me because up to this point, I've talked to professors and PhD students, and this is my first master's student that I've gotten to talk to. So, just a reminder that this podcast is all about research at all levels. So, if you are a master's student, you may just be interviewed on my podcast as well. So let's get started because this is a really cool topic and I don't want to take away from it anymore in the intro. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Ellie Bob. Yeah, I'm really happy because right now it is like 70 degrees, which feels cold because it's been like almost 100 degrees here for a
Oh my
week.
God. Well, I'm in New
So,
York. It's like we've
oh,
been in like swampland for like weeks.
yeah.
I mean, I'm from Florida, so this is not like I'm kind of a little in my comfort zone where I'm like, oh, I'm used to the really high heat, but like being in like all the concrete and like I don't know, it's kind
Mm.
of intense, but you
Oh
know,
yeah, New York City heat is crazy. Are you in NYC itself or are you outside
I'm
of
in
New York?
Brooklyn. No, I'm in like
Okay, yeah,
Brooklyn
yeah.
proper. Yeah. I've lived in New York for coming up a decade this year. So I came for undergrad
Okay.
and then just like many people just didn't leave, you know? But
You
yeah.
get stuck and then the pay grade doesn't give you enough to save up and then you're just, you stay there and you
Yeah.
get used to the abusive nature of New York City.
Yeah, totally, totally. Oh, no, it's good.
I'm okay, so your topics are so cool and I'm really excited to get into them. But before we do, I was wondering if you could kind of just run us through your academic journey thus far and how you got into what you got into in your degrees and all of that kind of stuff.
It's been a long process. I feel like what's probably most helpful is to start from undergrad, because like I said, I grew up in South Florida. I'd always like written, like I always loved to write, like fiction, poetry, and like doing creative writing. And I got to a point where, I was thinking about college and in my head I was like, well, New York is the place to go. Like I want to work in publishing. I had these like very like the most like stereotypical like dreams of going to New York where I was like, I'm going to work
Mm,
at a big five publisher and I'm going to be an editor and like I'm going to do all these things. And then I get to New York and I just kind of end up continuously working in like art museums. And I do some like magazine work, I do like some like internships, and I'm doing some freelance writing. But I kept just kind of again and again ending up like in the art world. And I get to this point where I'm kind of like, well, you know, I have to figure out a way to kind of combine this like love of literature and love of writing with like this love of art history. And so that was kind of how that began. But in undergrad, I ended up doing English. So I did end up doing like my stereotypical, like, classic, like New York
Yeah.
style. But I ended up doing like a minor in art history, started at that point to get also into like architectural and design history. And then I ended up doing a creative writing concentration that started off as poetry, but then also turned into um, like art criticism and like nonfiction writing, but also like genre fiction. So thinking about like science fiction as well. And it was at that point I ended up also in like the environmental humanities like side of things, because environmental humanities historically is pretty like based in English departments for some reason. I don't know why. It's
Interesting.
like English and then like medieval studies is like usually it's very funny. Like, and I have a lot of scholars who I love who like are kind of in those fields. But then at that point, I was starting to kind of learn more about like, oh, eco-poetics, like nature-based writing. What does it mean to look at how landscapes are represented in, pieces of media or in
Mm.
text, and how does that reflect maybe like bigger social issues? I started also at that point thinking about like multi-species stuff a little bit. Um, and so that was like kind of the initial trajectory. And then when I graduated, I briefly like interned at the Met in their publications department. So I did end up getting the best of both worlds of like working in publishing, but also at an art institution. Um, and then COVID hit, and I was working as a librarian at like a sketchbook library that no longer exists in Brooklyn, but it was like this archive. And at that point, I was getting really into, heritage preservation, like quite literally through these like sketchbooks that I was like stewarding, but also thinking about working with contemporary artists and what that looks like. I was obviously still writing poetry and like doing a lot of my own like art criticism on top of all of that. And I knew I'd wanted to go to grad school, but I told myself I'm gonna wait a year after undergrad. Like I don't want to go straight in. Like I want to work in the field and see truly A, if grad school is right for me, B, what am I actually going to do with grad school? Like, what am I actually going to do? Like, what do I want to actually
Hmm.
focus on? Because like I think people
Yeah.
sometimes jump into it and because they're like, scared about going out into the world and, academia, like if that's where you thrive, like that's where you thrive. But I knew that I wanted to kind of move with intention into that sort of next stage of life. And so, but COVID derailed that by like 2 years. So my like 1 year hiatus became like a kind of 2.5 year hiatus. And I found this really unique program at NYU, which was their experimental humanities program, also called XE. And learning about it, like it essentially is a very open form department. Like my master's degree was in interdisciplinary studies, but you could kind of do whatever you wanted, more or less. Like you could
Mm.
go in basically proposing like projects that were related to a number of different disciplines. In my friend group there, like I had a friend who does work on nuclear disarmament. I'm doing my weird like nature shit. I have another friend doing like sociology adjacent work about like trans youth, and then another, friend doing stuff on like mushrooms. So it was like everyone was kind of doing like different things, and I knew that that felt really aligned with how I move through the world, which is just constantly drawing from different disciplines, constantly wanting to learn about, not only contemporary things, but historical things and kind of drawing all those different through lines together. And so, yeah, that was like how I ended up in grad school, and really was focused on doing more environmental art focused things, but also thinking about how can I expand on art criticism and art historical scholarship and bring in things like environmental science to like talk about these really new movements that have emerged around like art and climate change and art and issues like climate refugees and issues of like species extinction and all these kind of big questions and how art can be a vehicle for that. And in that I also did like a museum studies like certificate program also because again I'd been working in cultural institutions and I sort of knew that my research was going to get more into like how climate change impacts heritage preservation, how climate change impacts cultural institutions, but also something I was clocking was museums, like more and more museums, more and more galleries were starting to put on these kinds of shows. And I was really interested in kind of studying that and like why is this happening at this moment? What kind of art is being produced? What kind of materials or mediums are artists using to talk about these issues? But also how does that impact like visitors? again, me working in museums, I'm also like, what's the visitor
Mhm.
experience of this, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so this is all a very long-winded way of saying that, I really love ultimately the trajectory that I had where I had this kind of like very like literary background that I was then sort of able to leverage and work into so many other parts of what I'm interested in. And so it's definitely been like a very interdisciplinary journey for sure. And I think kind of from the beginning, really.
I mean, I think that's really important because I think a lot of academia is starting to notice that we need to make things interdisciplinary, that you can't keep things separate
Yeah.
because the world doesn't keep things separate. Humans aren't one thing or another. They're
Yeah.
made up of multiple pieces.
Mhm.
So I've been noticing as I'm talking to people just how interdisciplinary all of these different things have become. I mean, my communications degree, I technically was a fashion
Mhm.
track on it, but most of that fashion track was sustainability, whether or not I liked it. Because some of the conversations around sustainability need to
Yeah.
evolve a little bit.
Yeah.
But through that, I really started to realize just how many conversations had to occur within a singular topic like fashion.
Mhm.
Um, and then started spending more time in museums and realizing that museums are now starting, like you said, starting to really think about the visitor more than they used to.
Yeah.
Um, and
Okay.
especially being in a place like France, it's interesting going from like the Louvre and the Orsay, going over to the Musée des Arts Décoratifs and the Petit
Yeah.
Palais, and realizing the differences between the two styles of museum,
Oh, yeah.
where one is very clearly like, this is our collection, look at it. And then the
Mm.
other is, how do we make these subjects come alive for our visitors?
Yeah.
Um,
No,
so I definitely see so much value in that work, and it's so important that we have people that are moving into that.
yeah. I mean, the interdisciplinary stuff has been really funny. I'll be honest to like navigate because I feel like a lot of institutions are like aware that interdisciplinarity is really important and like are can create some really interesting, exciting like new methods. But I feel like also my experience at the same time was no one could really pinpoint like what interdisciplinarity like is, you know?
Yeah.
And so it's this kind of funny thing to be a part of what feels like a very kind of burgeoning moment or a moment that's
Mhm.
really actively evolving really quickly. And it was so fun. I mean, I'm now going into a PhD program come September in art history, but that application process was really fascinating because again, I'm coming in with this very like interdisciplinary, like undeniably interdisciplinary kind of background. And but at the PhD level, everything is still quite disciplinary. Like these departments will use these as buzzwords, but realistically, in the actual like application side of things, or like as you kind of talk to people more, you're like, oh, these departments like use that word, but then if you try to take classes in another department, they might give you like some pushback, you know? And that was
Yeah.
something I heard from a few people. So I feel really lucky that like where I've ended up, like my research is genuinely like very supported and I think also doing contemporary art is kind of a challenge to do it at like an upper academic level because it is so new. And people prefer like more kind of like extended historical research. But yeah, it's definitely very funny to think about that. But yeah, and even to the museum side of things, like thinking about the multisensory, thinking about how you can bring in like different tools and technologies and perspectives. Like it's been cool to also see how that's really evolved too as museums are
Mm.
thinking about like how can we expand on the exhibition as a form, and kind of think more big picture about what role we're playing in our communities, how people are encountering these works or these artists, and what they're sort of taking away from that. Yeah.
Well, and looking into the research that you're doing
Mhm.
is fascinating to me because I think, as excited as I am about forward thinking and moving museums into new places, there are still areas of that that I haven't even considered yet. And your thesis being around sculpture parks and the use of outdoor spaces to display art
Yeah.
purposefully was so mind-opening and really cool, because I mean, I grew up in Seattle. We have the Olympic Sculpture Park.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
very famous. I lived in New York. There's the Socrates Sculpture Park in Queens. So I've always kind of found myself around these spaces, but not
Yeah.
really considering them as museums or as like culturally important. It's just like, oh, look, I'm wandering through a park and there's a giant sculpture right here.
Yeah.
So it was great to read a paper that made me stop and think, oh yeah, there's actual use for this. Like this is a necessary thing.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, like with Storm King, like choosing that as my subject, I hadn't actually, I'm still trying to figure out, oh no, I can tell you actually how I ended up writing about this. Where I like so Storm King is closed during the winter. It's open spring through summer, usually in upstate New York. And I remember I had gone with my dad. He was like visiting from Boston, and we somehow decided like we're gonna do like a Storm King like day. And I remember him and we were walking around and, it's huge. Storm King is massive. Much larger than like most other sculpture parks. Like I think it's like one of the largest, if not the largest sculpture park in maybe North America. Like it's huge. And we're walking around, and at that point it was getting into kind of fall, like the seasons were changing. And the work had been, on display to the public, like had been open, visible for months. And so we're walking around and I just start like looking down at the sculptures and I start like looking at like their bases and like their pedestals and noticing things like, oh, there's this piece made of like rubber tire that has like moss growing on it. Or there's like little mushrooms, like little fungi kind of like cropping up. There's like these like, Mark de Severo sculptures that are these like raw kind of exposed steel beams and like you can see all the patterns of like all the rust. Um, and like watching these kind of like artworks which normally in a museum context are displayed in these really like pristine ways, like watching them get kind of contaminated by the land and like watching the land itself also contribute to the experience of viewing this artwork and also kind of adding, let's say, their own artistic hand to the experience. Like it was really really fascinating to me. And then there's this piece by Maya Lin called Wave Hill, and I remember when we were walking we like encountered this sign, and Wave Hill was closed. I still never have walked on it, if you can believe this. I've written about this sculpture. I've still never managed to get there when it's open. But it's like this sign that exists now that was like, we close this sculpture for half of the month every month to let the grass grow back. And, they had all this
Mm.
explanation about like how the piece was landscaped, how, the conservation of this is really important, and all these kinds of things. And I was like, this is so interesting. Like this conservation consideration, is always something that comes up in art, and in collecting and museum work, but outdoor conservation is a whole nother animal. And then on top of that, like Storm King, what I found really interesting about them was they really wanted to also focus on the landscape as well. And so I was really interested in thinking about outdoor sculpture parks as not just like, oh, it's a museum and it's outside and like the novelty of that, but like, no, like these are living ecosystems that are like comprised not only of human interventions via the landscaping and remediation and, moving artworks around and installing stuff and digging into the earth and like planting things, but also like what has kind of cropped up there since, and like what has thrived, like what species have thrived there, what are native plants that are there. In the case of Storm King, part of the land used to be like open gravel pits and like disused farm fields. And like it's cool to see where the traces of that like might still exist and like what does it mean to pay attention. So yeah, that project was really fun. I really enjoyed doing it and doing like a kind of like I did like a kind of like nature like tour almost where I played on like the visitors map with all these different sites of different species you can see. And so it was really cool to kind of offer like a different perspective and explore like what does it really mean to have this outdoor space and to engage in nature in this way. But also like all the non-human actors that also play a really important part in the preservation, but also degradation of these sculptures. So yeah, it was really cool.
One upstate New York, I feel like unless you live in New York, you don't think about upstate. Like
Yeah.
as someone who grew up in Seattle, I guess I always kind of considered that whole area to just kind of be Connecticut.
Yeah. I
Like
mean,
it you
just
just forget
accessible
it's
enough
there.
sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's so beautiful, especially the Hudson River Valley area, and it's such a different culture and a different ecosystem to the city that it must
Mhm.
have just been incredible getting to find an excuse to go there and research it.
Yeah. Well, it was so cool too to like also talk with like the staff there. So I ended up working like speaking primarily to their like head of conservation, which I kind of love. Their head of conservation is also their like head groundskeeper, which I'm like, that's so sick. Dream job. But like it was really cool to talk with him because he really didn't have like a traditional kind of like art conservation background. Like he really like came in like doing the landscaping. And then kind of as a consequence of again how this park is set up, all the kinds of like ecological stuff that happens there. Like he ended up getting more and more involved in like the install side of stuff. And it was really cool. Like he had so many crazy stories. Like he was telling me also that he goes to New York quite frequently if like for instance MoMA Sculpture Garden, like they need advising
Mhm.
on something and he'll like consult. And so that I thought was like a funny kind of cross-pollination. And even like Mark de Severo, like you mentioned Socrates Sculpture Park, like Mark de Severo was like installing sculptures at Storm King, I think before Socrates Sculpture Park like opened. So it was cool to like read those stories too in like the archives of like they're installing this giant Mark de Severo, but like fuck, these storm clouds are coming, and the people like realize like oh shit, we've just planted these giant lightning rods essentially in this field.
Oh
No, I'm serious. It was like, and
no.
God, it was so funny. It was like an oral history, and I was cracking up because they were like, yeah, like everyone could feel like the hair on their arms like rise up from the static. They now have lightning rods, I should say. But it was like that, like experimentation, like that they like
Hmm.
at this like place began as this really interesting venture of like, we're just gonna put shit out here in the land and see what happens, and like how that's gonna shift like people's perception and all of the work that they had to do to like remediate the land. Because, like I said, a lot of it had been open gravel pits because the New York State Highway was like constructing, the highway and it like goes by Storm King. And, it was an empty farm field that they just like dug up completely. And so like also these bigger considerations of like how do we also heal this land, but also shape it
Mm.
into something that can display artwork, and like how does the landscaping act as like this framing device, but also as this like agent or actor in all of this. Like it was just so cool to kind of trace that history from like the archives from like the 1960s, like all the way to today. But yeah.
I'm backing up just a little bit to something you said earlier about watching the degradation of the art pieces and things like that. Something that struck me in your thesis was you said that it's important to welcome decay as a potential aesthetic collaborator rather than a threat. And that really struck me because I
Mhm.
feel like you're right in as you put it, the white box in the traditional museum setting. You're doing everything possible to make sure that decay doesn't happen, that there's no
Yeah.
loss of art. And I mean, one of my favorite YouTube channels is Baumgartner Restoration, like sitting there and
Yeah.
watching
Yeah.
these paintings
Mhm.
being brought back to life as they've decayed and come back to presumably where the artist originally wanted them to be. But
Yeah.
then reimagining this idea of decay being part of the artwork and being a necessary thing that you then can take in as part of the conversation that the art is able to contribute to is such a
Yeah.
cool idea.
I mean, decay has been hilariously like this reoccurring theme or thread that like predates actually my current scholarship. Like this was something I also was thinking about a lot when I was really in the throes of like my poetic practice and like poetry writing. Like, what does it mean for language to decay? Like, what does it mean to sort of represent material processes of decay through like written word? Um, and then yeah, Storm King, obviously in the outdoor context, like you're kind of in this constant state of almost like entropy, where you're having to like constantly, push back against the elements, but also it becomes this really interesting dance of like certain acceptable levels of like decay and like contamination and rot, and at what point do you intervene? And that's like a huge like big ethical debate that like exists in the conservation world that I love tapping
Mm.
into. But even in like some of my other research too, I've really been interested in like artists who use like living biological material like plants, fungi, soil, like things that can grow, and like putting those in art galleries, like putting that kind of stuff in these spaces that we think of as very clean and very sterile. Um, like I love witnessing that. And I love also the sensorium that it creates. I mean, a piece that I reference constantly is this work by this artist, Daniel Lai, who had a show at the New Museum, I think it was maybe 2018. And basically, what they did was they had this like full gallery on like the first floor, and they fill it with soil, terracotta pots, like burlap, cloth and seeds and all these things. And then they just water it and then leave and just let it kind of do its thing. And I remember I went like when it opened, like right when it opened. And then I went right when it closed, however many months later. And it was
Mm.
like the sensory experience of like walking into that room and getting struck by like the smell of the soil, the rot, like everything going on. It was just so like moving. But then also as I'm walking around the sculpture, because there's soil like on the ground, it was so funny to see like people's footprints in the soil,
Mm.
because clearly what was happening was people didn't know how close they could get to the art, and they couldn't figure out like what's the proper protocol here with like engaging with this work. So there was definitely people like stepping into this piece and like sticking their hands in the soil, and like I don't know, it was just that was so cool. And work like artists who like use botanical material like that or fungal material. I've been really getting drawn into it more and more because that sensory element is so moving and it can be so unsettling and so uncanny. But it also, I think, helps reveal these little like corners of the world that maybe we don't always think about, or, especially in a built environment like New York, like bringing that kind of outside in um, can really reshape the way we grapple with not only local issues, but also things at like the national level, internationally, especially climate change, like sort of big picture. But yeah, like decay, it's like I feel like I like laugh about like I love decay, like I love the rot so much, and like I love bringing it up. But it's like I don't know, it's just something that always like haunts me, and I'm always thinking about. And I think maybe that's also the product, frankly, of growing up in Florida, where I'm from South Florida, and growing up in like fifth grade science class, we would look at like climate modeling maps, and I would just watch my house, like where my house is on the map, like just get covered by a sea of
Mhm.
blue, and like sea level rise, hurricanes, like I feel like I've had these very vivid experiences, and like
Mm.
I'm thinking a lot about like that decay and that loss, but also how decay itself can be this very generative practice, or this generative tool, or this generative method to really like reshape the way we like experience the world, but also how we remember and preserve culture.
And I mean, this might be me ascribing a meta narrative that doesn't actually exist and I'm just overthinking things. But I feel like I personally have seen a lot more art and fashion and film and television that has been surrounding this idea of decay and death and everything that goes along with that
Mhm.
since the pandemic. And I think that kind of area, that experience, as a globe, we experience something that we were coming out of the early 2000s, which was kind of like a rebirth of the 1980s land of excess. Like we're doing all of these huge rhinestone encrusted things and gold everywhere and mirrors, and we want to live life in big ways. And then all of a sudden we were shut indoors and confronted with mortality as thousands of people were dying, and as we couldn't do anything but think, oh no, am I going to get sick and die as well? So it's interesting to see this kind of, at least, like I said, at least this is my observations, I could be totally off base, but to see this shift in art to seeing artworks and fashion choices and films that are looking at what does death mean and what does decay mean and what does it mean to be at the end of something.
Mm,
um like there's someone I follow on Instagram who creates these beautiful works of fashion that obviously take hours to create, that look like Victorian corsets and Edwardian gowns, but then they look like they're rotting and they look like they're falling apart, and the lace is torn, and they're painted to look like they have mold on them, and they're that's the finished art piece, is that it looks like it's falling apart. Or even, I mean, the Met last year had their Sleeping Beauties exhibit, which was showing fashion pieces that were literally too delicate because of that rot and because of that effect of time, that they
mm,
couldn't be displayed in usual ways anymore because of that.
yeah,
And there were nature elements in that exhibit as well. And
yeah,
I just think it's such an important conversation to have right now, as we've just all come through this time where we were faced
yeah.
with mortality.
I mean, yeah, like we're living in precarious times, and like I'm not really surprised actually that, like things like The Last of Us. I mean, The Last of Us is a video game like predates COVID, but like
Hmm.
seeing the way the TV show like blew up in the way that it did, and
Yeah.
like, like there's clearly like people are really thinking about these things, or people are being confronted with these kinds of things in a way that like you can't really like hide from anymore, or, like avoid.
Hmm.
And I think also like as a society too, we're also really grappling with like the consequences of things like consumerism, especially in this kind of like post-capitalist, post-industrial, state of America, like
Yeah.
how have those landscapes like, and a lot of people in their day-to-day lives encounter the remnants of those landscapes, whether it's like an abandoned building or an abandoned factory or pollution in a river, like that kind of stuff as well. And so I think you're totally spot on in that, like, yeah, like people are really like grappling with that and turning to decay as this kind of like mode to wrestle with that. But I will say, like, for me at least, I never see decay as necessarily moving towards like an end or a finale or like a
Mhm.
death. Like, I always see decay as like a state of transformation and one
Mm.
in which you can have like different kinds of time and temporality, you know, intersecting with each other at the same time. I think about decay, especially in the ecological context, as this product of like collaboration between all of these different organisms, and they're all trying to kind of do these things and feeding themselves and feeding, their kind of own biotic communities. And so even to us, when it looks like death, like ultimately that life like force is kind of being transmitted out or moved out through these landscapes or through these ecosystems or through these societies in different ways. And so, yeah, like excavating that and has been really cool in my kind of art historical research, but also like in my creative writing as well. Um, yeah, it's just really, really fascinating. And again, so not surprising. I don't know, like
Yeah.
for a moment, yeah, makes a ton of sense.
Well, and as someone who grew up in the Pacific Northwest, nature has always been at the forefront of my mind. Like,
Yeah,
you think of Seattle and you think of coffee, you think of Starbucks, or you think of Microsoft, and then you think of hiking. Like, it's those
yeah,
three things. And um growing up, going out into the woods, like, there used to be just huge patches of woods in the middle of cities, like just untouched woods, and we would go out and play in them all the time. And
yeah.
the I'm reminded during this conversation of nurse logs, and how
Mm,
when one tree dies and falls over, immediately it's used as a life builder for the next trees, or or fungus, or
yeah.
animals that need a home and can burrow into it. Like, it's not something that just
Hmm.
stops when it's over. It becomes part of the next stage of life. And it's so cool that art can kind of show us that without us having to wait the, like, 80 to 300 years for a tree to grow and die and fall over. And
I mean, and yeah, like I think another through line that I've seen come up in my research too is like this kind of tension or like exploration of these dynamics between like the artificial and like the built environment and like the unbuilt
mm,
environment. I struggle with the word wilderness, and I think people really like, I don't know, it's a term that I can sometimes find problematic depending on the context, but like, yeah, like thinking about these like built environments and, cities, landscapes, obviously living in New York, but also like in suburban Florida. Like it's something that I've always found really fascinating is in the kind of suburban sprawl, you've increasingly had communities go more and more like closer to the Everglades. And so growing up, you would hear so many news stories of like alligators and like people's swimming pools, like we would have pythons that people would release into the Everglades from the exotic pet trade, and then they would like end up in people's toilets. And like, and it's so funny because when you live there, there's so much time dedicated to like the maintenance of your property and like, mowing the lawn, trimming the bushes, planting these things. And then, a hurricane will come through and like completely wreck all of that. Or, stuff may start to grow in this really unruly way. These native plants will like, be like, fuck you, this is my home, and just start growing there. And so, yeah, like that kind of built environment versus the unbuilt is always really fun to kind of grapple with and like explore. And I think very much the product of my upbringing, but also even now just being in New York.
I mean, you saying that just kind of unlocked a thought in my mind about how landscaping, like typical landscaping, like lawns and just planting a tree in your yard, is in and of itself curated art. Like, in the same way that putting on clothing in the morning and walking outside presents to the world something we want the world to know about us,
Hmm.
so do the plants that we grow and the way that we leave our home. um I've never it sounds silly, as someone who has studied fashion and is so concerned with presentation to the world, as a lot of us are now that we are on TikTok and are on social media in general. Like, we're concerned with how we present. I've never considered our lawns as part of that artwork and part of that presentation.
Yeah, I mean, not to jump around too, but like thinking about like presentation and appearance and things like that, like that's something that's also come up for me in a lot of like the queer ecologies like research that I do as well.
Mm,
Like I just recently finished, I'm so sad I couldn't share it with you because it's not online yet, but it will be soon. I did this like writing fellowship through the Architectural League of New York that like just finished like literally a month ago. And for my final kind of big writing piece that I did, I actually focused on the Alice Austen house in on Staten Island in New York. And for context, Alice Austen, famous like street photographer, but also like lesbian in the early 1900s, late 1800s. And she lived in this house on the coastline of Staten Island with her partner, her life partner for like 30 years. She grew up there. It was her childhood home and she had a garden. And so there's been a lot of new scholarship, and what I talk about is the museum now, the House Museum, like taking up this kind of question of like Alice Austen's like gardening practice and like the legacies of her gardening. And now they have a queer ecologies garden where they're looking at things like non-normative gender presentation in plants and like non-normative
mm,
reproduction strategies and like how those connect to people's like lived experiences with queerness, and like kind of blurring that line between the ecological and the cultural. And with Alice Austen, it was really fun. Like she would often stage photographs in her garden because she had these like huge wisteria bushes. Like it looked like a jungle. You look at the archival photos and it's like crazy. But like she and her friends would get dressed in gender non-conforming clothing. Like they would put on like men's clothes, like for the time, which was very scandalous, and they would like photograph themselves, like embracing each other, being on this like stretch. And, her house really became, and her garden became this refuge for expression that at the time was like
mm.
so not welcome by society, but also so heavily policed. And so, yeah, like this idea of like how the ecological can also become a way of like self-presentation or like, the representation of a society or a culture. Like that, I think is also something that I've noticed come up increasingly more as I've dabbled in these like landscape studies or in these garden studies, that oftentimes are very also interconnected with like art practices.
That's fascinating to me. Like I'm sitting here trying to come up with questions about that, and this is what it looks like when I'm just so invested in a topic that I'm just like, I don't know where to start with this. So when you say queer representations within gardening, what does that look like?
Gardening is like so gay. Like gardening is like like
That is very true.
cried. No, but like seriously, like when you think about, in the kind of like Victorian era, late 1800s,
Mm,
1900s, oftentimes people would signal to each other. I mean, also let's go back to Sappho. I mean, people would use flowers
yeah.
as a way of communicating their queerness, right? But then also you would have these movements of like gardening where these gardens would be so elaborately landscaped, and because of that, they would act as like refuges and they would act as like forms of
Mm,
escape. Like in New York, public parks were oftentimes really big cruising places, and it was because like I remember in doing my research for the Alice Austen house, I was looking up like other kind of sites that had like landscapes that have queer history in New York. And I ended up learning about this one place in like Flushing Meadows, Corona Park in Queens, where there was actually like protesters came and protested because local people were trying to kind of stop them from cruising. And they were like, fuck
yep.
you, no, like we live here too. And we want to use this landscape in order to, live the lives that we want. I also think about like the piers, like the Christopher Street piers. That was a
Mm,
pretty industrial landscape, but also you had a lot of like the land itself being reclaimed with vegetation and things like that. And, it became this kind of place where you could go and, seek shelter and find community. And even today, like in contemporary gardens, like in whether it's your, community garden on your block or, the garden that you might have at your house, you're always your connection to the land ends up being this kind of source of comfort. But also, what I love about queer ecologies is that they kind of force you to think about, okay, but like also these plants like do embody more of that kind of queerness than maybe we think. Like gender, the way that it manifests in the natural world is just like so different and oftentimes so contradictory to how we describe things in human terms. And so it's very, very fascinating. And I feel very blessed. Like I have a friend Lee who runs this project called the Institute for Queer Ecology. I have a lot of friends who kind of engage in that work. So I feel like I've learned a lot from them, frankly, of how all this works. But Yeah, like thinking about something as strange as like the tropical ecosystem of South Florida, a lot of
Mm.
times like that, there's been a really long history of like countercultural movements, people like hiding out in the Everglades, and kind of seeking escape from these dominant social structures like through nature. And I think those histories are really important. And it's cool to see more artists taking that theme up. But also it's something I'm really hoping to also grapple with more in like my own scholarship. That connection between the ecological and the cultural.
Well, I mean, even terms that are used for queer people are landscape or plant terms. Like gay men have been called pansies since the
Mhm.
very beginning. Like just the idea of using flowers as language, especially in that time period, the Victorian, the slash Gilded Age slash Belle Epoque. That I love
Mhm.
that era. That's like my, if I could go back in time and did and not have the political ramifications of it, that's where I would go. But flowers and plants in general were a language. Like people were sending each other bouquets
Mhm.
in lieu of notes because it was a code that they could use to express their feelings to each other without getting in trouble socially necessarily. um so it yeah, I've never thought of the act of gardening as being queer as well, just like specific plants. So you're blowing my mind today, and I appreciate it.
I mean, and it was really touching too, like when I was speaking with some of the people who worked at the Alice Austin House, for instance. Like, yeah, there's a lot of like historical kind of material, especially in New York. Like, there's a lot of stuff related to that. And I think also in England to a certain extent, there's been a lot of
Oh
scholarship
yeah.
dedicated to these sort of like queer histories of gardening and garden landscaping design. But I remember I was talking to an educator there, and like they were saying, like, yeah, like most the garden is for the most part stewarded by like queer youth. Like they come from different schools like across Staten Island, Brooklyn to some extent, but really it's mostly like Staten Island like local kids who come and they participate with their school field trips. And then oftentimes they end up coming back. And like this educator I was speaking with, they were like, yeah, like these kids come here and they're able to just like be who they want to be. They're able to meet people who are like them, and if their home, isn't necessarily a safe space for them, then this garden can be. And I think that, it taps into this really long, really rich, really fascinating history. And so, like, it was really cool to kind of see an example of that happening in the present day, and how these kind of like little historical like echoes or reverberations are still being felt by, queer people in the present.
That also makes me think about kind of the dichotomy between gardening and farming and the gender assigned to those. Like in
Mhm.
society it feels like gardening is a very kind of feminine thing to do versus farming, which is a very masculine thing to do, but they're both stewardship of plants. Like it's the same thing just for different purposes, and yet one is considered more feminine and one is considered more masculine, and so it does involve these kind of political social issues just by wanting to be around plants.
Yeah. No, totally. And but it's so funny too, because then you have things like, like lesbian separatist movements in like the 1960s where like everyone was like, we're gonna build a commune, and like so
Yeah.
and so like that also is really like fascinating to me. And like frankly, like something I do want to learn more about is like histories of like rural queerness and like rural queer community formation. Because also I think like, when we talk about queer history, it tends to be very like city centric and very like urban
Yeah.
centric. Unsurprisingly in a lot of respects, because yeah, like like cities historically have been these kind of havens and can hold these huge populations of queer people. But like, I think being from the South also, it's like a lot of times those kinds of queer histories are not really represented in the way, like I wish that there was more talk and consideration. And being from Florida can be kind of hard because I feel like sometimes people are like, yeah, Florida's fucking crazy, like fuck them, like it's like this conservative hellhole. And I'm like, yeah, like I get it, but also like marginalized people live here too, and like queer people live here too. And Miami as like a city, as I'm gonna get into a whole nother tangent. Long story short, I've been working with this environmental arts nonprofit in Miami for a few years now, and we're working on a project which is a National Heritage Area designation through the National Park Service for this body of water called Biscayne Bay. So in this NHA application, I have been doing a lot of research about the history of Miami, and kind of how different communities have used this body of water in Miami's beaches, for a long time. And at one point, like Miami was nicknamed like Fairyland because you had like a lot of like early drag. Like, yes, we know drag, like we tend to associate it with like New York primarily. But like you had clubs like this place called the Jewel Box that was like right by the water that would host, like they would like cross-dressing dancers and like you read these like advertisements and like it was essentially early drag was like what it was before there was really like a language for it. Obviously beaches have a long history of like, queer cruising and stuff like that. So obviously also in Miami. But like, yeah, and this is all to say that like it is sometimes quite frustrating, like writing about the South, like thinking about the South as like a potential subject area in my research because I think people are really quick to kind of disregard it. And I'm like, no, like these histories are so important and they contribute to a bigger sense of like how queer communities have kind of lived across America, but also like the very specific regional histories that are there are so rich and so fascinating. And like the ways in which people have found ways to resist systemic violence to make community for themselves, even in the face of these like great odds and all of this tremendous marginalization, it's so compelling. And so I really want to like find more ways to also just bring that to light, because it's just like
Yeah.
I feel like it gets so overlooked and so like written off, especially being now in New York.
Oh, I mean, as someone from the North, the South does get written off a lot, and I think there's obvious prejudice there because certain wars never actually ended. We just said they did, and then never resolved anything. Um, but I think you're right in that it's a huge disservice because there are so many cultures in the South. The North just kind of lumps them all together and says, no, that's just the South. They're all like that. They all have the same accent. They're all kind of dumb. They're all kind of crazy. We don't talk
Yeah.
about that. But but within the South, you're talking about Louisiana and Mississippi and Florida and Alabama and uh, there's just so many cultures represented and so many histories that are represented and so many stories that are overlooked because for 6 months in the country's past, they were
Yeah.
like, deuces, a bunch of white men were like, deuces, we're going to do our own thing over here, and then ruined it for everyone else down there, as
Yeah.
as usually happens.
Like the South itself is like literally like statistically like one of the most diverse parts of the United States. Like the
Mhm.
amount of immigrant communities that are there. Like my family is Romanian. Florida randomly huge Romanian community. Like,
Huh.
and you hear about like all of these different like communities that exist. Yeah, in like places like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. As just like an aside, love like studying all the foodways, like new kind of emerging like foodways that come
Mhm.
out of these communities coming here and finding ways of sort of to rework traditional like food practices in the South. That's also like a whole nother thing that I find so like, yeah, like that kind of diversity and like finding ways to showcase that. I feel like only recently there's been more attention. But truly, that's also just frankly the product of the people who live there who are working really fucking hard to bring those stories to light. And, I feel like as a scholar, I want to like help with that process and help with that experience because that kind of visibility is so important and, so helpful. But yeah, it's just, I think it's so incredibly fascinating. All of the histories there, histories of art, histories of landscape and, landscaping and environmental issues and all of those things that kind of intersect together. And yeah, like I think when I'm going to my PhD program, I'm definitely going to be doing like a kind of American like focus. Like I always knew that I wanted the United States to be where I do my art historical research. Like Europe is cool, but I feel like I want to write about the American South. And something that I ran into was it was really fucking hard to find like scholars at the PhD level who, or like professors who could be potential like supporters of that. Like it's
Yeah.
really like there's a big lack that I feel like I clocked, at least up here in the Northeast, because I frankly just I want to stay in New York. This is my community. Like this is where,
Mhm.
I work and I've thrived. But like in that application process, like it was really interesting to see. Like American Studies was just kind of relegated to like American Studies as like a separate discipline. But I was like, okay, but what about like histories of American art that aren't just like New York or California, you know?
Mhm.
And so that was
Or
really,
aren't rooted only in the late 19th century and early photography. Like
yeah,
there's
yeah.
so much more.
Yeah, totally, totally. So like that was also like a whole interesting thing. And again, I feel really happy with where I've ended up because I'm like, oh, it's really cool to have like I know I have a professor who specifically does like histories of the American South, like looking at material culture and the transatlantic slave trade, And so I'm like, okay,
Mm.
it's gonna be really cool to be able to push myself to, go back to the South, like do this research, but also have that kind of academic, like institutional support. Because that's also so important as a scholar to like be able to find that.
That is definitely something that I'm coming across as well as I'm working on applying and finding advisors is wading through current ways of describing their research and trying to parse out, okay, well, this is what I want to study, so who actually is going to be a good advisor for this,
Mhm.
because no one else is really talking about this specific topic right now. So how do I
Mhm.
who do I talk to? Who do I think is going to get excited about helping me and is going to be able to help me find that base theory that I can then build off of? And that goes back to just the beginning of our conversation where we were talking about interdisciplinary things and how so many PhDs right now are interdisciplinary in nature and require so many new ways of thinking and new methodologies and new ways of finding information, that academia hasn't demonstrated before. So finding advisors who are willing to take a chance on those things is difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've been tremendously lucky on that front where especially when I was in grad school, doing this like weird, like this so funny fucking research on like outdoor sculpture parks and like doing essentially like a biodiversity study of like a sculpture park, like why? And even like also my museum studies, like I did like a certificate sort of thesis on like climate resilient museum architecture and like how coastal museums, specifically Miami and Virginia, like how they, adapt their architecture and infrastructure, to do museum work. Like I feel really lucky that I had two advisors that one of whom she's so cool. She does like really interesting work on like the petrochemical industry and like fossil fuel extraction companies and their role in funding arts and cultural programs in Canada. So she's Canadian.
Mm,
She ended up going back to Canada, and it's a very Canadian specific history, but I find that so interesting. And that requires like not only having an art historical knowledge, but also having a knowledge of like how this industry works, in the same
mm,
way that I had to kind of learn about like climate resilient engineering in order to be able to talk about like how these museums are built.
yeah.
And then my other advisor, actually, for my Storm King thesis, was a soil scientist by trade, like by training. So they did not do any art history. And I was like, that's fine. I know I
I
can,
got that part covered.
yeah, I can take care of that. But I was like, I wanted you as my advisor because I want to be able to articulate the environmental science part of this research. I want to make sure that I'm like representing it like accurately and appropriately and so I feel really lucky in that way. But like, yeah, finding advisors can feel like dating, like it's just so funny
Yeah.
trying to figure out like who will I vibe with. And even over the years, I feel like I've had advisors where I expect them to be like the perfect advisor. And they, for whatever reason, maybe don't work out. Maybe our methods are very different, our views are very
Mhm.
different, even if our topics are similar. So that's been like a fun kind of journey as well to like figure out what that kind of support looks like and like what do I need as a scholar in order to thrive. And for me, it's been honestly working with people who have slightly different styles or like disciplines or subject areas from me because I feel like it just pushes me to kind of think outside the box a little more and to get a little more experimental with, how I approach my work.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well that let's now take a sidestep into our audience question. And so this is actually really interesting because our question does, it's not specifically about the environment, but it does have environmental implications behind it. So at Aaliyah Thomer asks, how will the idea of separating the art from the artist shift with the rise of AI art? Do you think people will desire a closer connection to artists' lives since they can't get that from AI? If so, what positive and negative outcomes do you see from that shift?
Ooh, that is a really good question. Oh my God. Damn. Okay, we're getting really existential here.
Yeah.
Oh my God. I The AI and art stuff is such a mess. Like,
Mm,
it's crazy. I think also because I have the added perspective of still being like a practicing working writer and also seeing like so many people I know in like the literary world grappling with like the consequences of AI.
mm,
I think I think it's gonna get worse before who knows what better looks like, but it's gonna get, I think, a lot worse, with like the AI slop and like all these kinds of things. But I think for me, my kind of big thing that I always feel compelled to remind people of when they bring in AI, whether it's in a gallery context or in an artistic context, is most of the time the AI tools that are like widely available to people are forms of theft, more or less. Like the styles that are being regurgitated by these like algorithms and these like machine learning systems are usually taken from other people. Um, this is not to say that like I don't have artists who I know use different kinds of AI tools or technologies, whether it's image generators or software that can like create like different kinds of things. Like I have those people. But I think there's going to be at some point this rupture almost between the kind of like slop commercialized, like we're like gonna get rid of illustrators and advertisements and like, like we're just gonna AI generate like all kinds of commercials and advertisements because it's cheaper. I think there's going to be a rupture where like that kind of goes in one direction, and artists who work with technology will kind of carve out and are actually kind of starting to already carve out kind of new, more experimental modes where we're not just using these technologies to reinforce a certain status quo. We're actually trying to use these systems in order to break them and to build weird shit and to make like interesting things. So it's always like, I think it's just such a complicated issue. I think for me, when it comes to thinking about AI and artists, my concern is like the financial part of it all, actually. Like, I want to make sure that artists are fairly compensated for their labor. I want to make sure that, artists are credited appropriately for their labor. My hope is that artists who do think about using AI and contemplating what that means, like, I hope they think long and hard about the ethical considerations, but also to do their research about the tools that are available to them. Like, are you actually creating original work, or are you going to just input some prompts that a computer will then spit back out at you, essentially plagiarized material? Like that's, I really hope that those kinds of questions are being grappled with. And, I try not to be really cynical and be like, people are just going to take the cheapest and fastest and most convenient way out, with these kinds of things. I mean, we're kind of already seeing that happen, but I do think we're at this weird turning point in the art world where like museums are trying to figure out like how to like use AI, but also like there's like a huge kind of like social like backlash almost, and like people are aware now of just how much theft goes into maintaining certain softwares and systems. So it's a constant like push and pull, I think in that respect. But yeah, I think also to this question of separating art from the artist, like I do think that now artists are at a place where they have to build a brand. And so in some ways, like you have not only the artist and like the artwork that they make, but also them now the artist is like a character, if that makes sense. Like the artist is a
Hmm.
brand. And I feel like that's been also interesting to see, especially with social media, where, you know, the cultural sector in locally, but also like in the US and frankly the world as a whole, has seen these really huge declines, like underfunding, less opportunities, especially for younger, like emerging artists. Like it's a lot harder to pursue gallery work. You have big institutions that really limit and kind of gatekeep, people's abilities to expand and grow their art careers. And so people turn to social media to try to like do that. And I don't really like, I don't say this in like a derogatory way. Like, I think you have to do what you need to do in order to, build the platform that you want to build and get your work out there. But like it is this kind of interesting moment where I think we talk about separating art from the artist in this like ethical question of like when artists behave badly and like how we consume their media. I think I'm thinking about it now in like also the content, like the artists like content that they produce versus also themselves as a brand and how they position
Mm.
themselves. And the ways in which social media and like these new tools and technology have really accelerated, I think, a lot of those bigger questions, and also kind of raise new considerations about like branding deals and like, collaborations with like companies, like, you know, and how a lot of those things are operating outside of the kind of traditional art world, outside of the traditional gallery system. And, it's really, really interesting. I don't know if there's like a hot take in there somewhere, but like I just find it really fascinating. And the AI question, like thinking about, at least for me, the kind of plagiarism and theft aspect of it all, like it's definitely something that makes me incredibly nervous. And I know, like, I'm going to be teaching as part of my PhD program. And already I've had a lot of friends talk about like students using AI in the classroom to like plagiarize and stuff like that. So that's like a whole other can of worms in and of
Hmm.
itself, And so, yeah, I think I feel always compelled to remind people that like these are tools, they are not solutions. Like they're not like fix-alls for your problems. Like you have to figure out how to use these tools in a way that's like accurate and ethically good and will actually help you and not just like make you not want to think anymore. Like
Yeah.
don't do that.
Yeah, on the plagiarism commentary, I think something that's been sad for me to see is with the conversations about people realizing that AI is plagiarism and is taking these styles from artists who have put their work online. It's also created this weird backlash commentary against young emerging artists who are doing what young emerging artists have always done in terms of copying styles and finding their
Mm-hmm.
finding their own voice by imitating previous voices, which is a genuine technique to becoming an artist. That's why like Leonardo da Vinci and artists like him had apprentices. They were learning to copy the style of the master
Mm-hmm.
in order to find their own voice. But the conversation around plagiarism in AI art has started to breed this conversation around any artist who copies a style and who copies, like I'm thinking of like those videos where you see a guy with the backward frame slowly rotating in, and people are like, "Oh no, it's going to be another white boy pretending to be Basquiat," and it's like, okay, but also that's how art works. Like at some point, you will find your voice in there and will diverge from the master that you're copying, but that's how
Mhm.
that works. It's a very different system than a
Yeah.
computer looking at art and saying, "Cool, I'm going to take this and put it here." Like it's very different, and it's sad to me, and I think it's going to put a lot of artists off becoming professionals
Mhm.
because people are just bullying them and saying, "No, you cannot learn this way," when it's a genuine way to learn.
Yeah, I think my one concern truly with like a lot of the kind of AI, again, the AI slop of it all, where like people are like just kind of generating stupid shit, like just like weird like videos, like stuff that's just
Yeah.
so like, hollow and meaningless and like so emotionless. It's like I think the thing that concerns me with like AI, like tools and technologies, and people like thinking of them as like potentially things to support art making, is my worry it actually will produce like a certain amount of like homogenous like homogeneity. Like I think it'll actually produce
Yeah.
people end up just kind of doing the same things because these programs aren't like actually that advanced. Like they're not as complex as I think people think they are. Like they will just kind of regurgitate like the same thing to everybody more or less depending on the prompts. Might be some differences, but like they're just working off of what they've been trained on, which is usually really limited, incredibly biased, and like very restrictive.
Yeah.
Um, and so like that's I think my big concern more than anything. But it is like I said, like I have friends who do use like different kinds of like AI technologies, not just like the kind of like Dreamweaver like whatever image generator. I think that's usually what people assume. But
Yeah.
like friends who code, for instance, who find ways to like, train machine learning software in these really weird, interesting ways. Like I have some friends actually who are like sculptors based out of the Netherlands and Eindhoven, and they actually will use machine learning in order to generate like speculative like marine life, like designs of like
Mm,
speculative marine life. And then they translate that into oftentimes like sculptures and installations. So it's not just like the AI, what's generated is not like the final product, it's like a
yeah.
step into a kind of final product. And I think
I,
that's like, that is really interesting.
I definitely think that's where we're going to, where we should at least end up with this. And I've said this multiple times to people in my everyday life, but this debate around generative AI feels so much like the debate in the early 2000s around Wikipedia, in
Mhm.
that teachers were like, "You can't use Wikipedia, it's evil, it's going to make all of us terrible researchers." And then we've all realized actually it's a great jumping off point for research, because you could type in a subject and then scroll to the bottom and there's a list of references that you can then go look, and it's become a tool. It's not the be all and end all, but it's become a tool. And I've been hearing from a lot of my peers, and I've started even experimenting with using ChatGPT as a way to kind of collect my thoughts, where
Yeah.
you can put in, these are all of the things I'm thinking. Can you succinctly put this down so I can better take my own notes, and find ways to use it that way, where it's not the one being
Mhm.
clever.
Yeah.
It's the tool to help you move forward when you're stuck.
I mean, I don't know, as someone who does, like, multi-species stuff, the, like, personification of AI kinda, like, really unsettles me, where people are
Yeah.
think it's so creative, like, it helps me, like and I'm like, "No, that's not really how these like, it's AI is like a tool for, like, pattern recognition," or, like,
Yes.
like yeah, like, organizing things for, like, say, an outline. But, like,
Hmm.
something that I'm kind of anticipating that I'm gonna have to, like, have these conversations with students of mine, frankly, in, like,
Yeah.
hopefully, like, a year. I start teaching, like, year 2. Like, I know I'm gonna have to have those conversations with students, and a lot of those conversations are just gonna be like, "Hey, heads up, AI hallucinates. AI can't actually think for itself. Like, it will make shit up. Like, it will hallucinate sources that don't exist. It will hallucinate quotes that don't exist. Like, it's not a person. Like, it actually can't think beyond very basic, rudimentary, like, prompts. Um,
Hmm.
and so, like, yeah, like, it's that I think is just like, it's crazy to see. Um, how that's going to impact academia. I mean, we're already kind of seeing the impacts. There was like that, New York Magazine article about, college kids using AI and all that stuff. But I'm very curious as to how like academic administrations plan on like addressing these
Hmm.
things because right now, like my friends who teach who are in PhDs right now, like they're teaching and TAing and like they feel like they don't really have a lot of recourse actually when it comes to like the plagiarism and theft part of things
Yeah.
because they're like, yeah, we're clocking our students are doing this and we can like fail them and make them redo assignments and stuff, but like that doesn't actually tackle like the bigger systemic issue. And I think the
Yeah.
problem is that a lot of these institutions are also like courting money for AI research. Like they want, with the NHS, like with the NHS getting funded, or sorry, the NIH, the like, all these, I
The
don't know.
American one, not the
Yeah,
English one.
too many different acronyms. But like you have all these like, federal funding cuts to like science research and like
Hmm.
arts research and stuff like that. And so these institutions are now like courting this money for AI, like private money for AI research, to try to like make their work as an institution more financially solvent. And like, yeah, they don't have a ton of incentive to crack down on this kind of like anti-intellectual stuff happening with like in the classroom. Like they have no incentive to do so. So that's like a whole other thing
It
that
reminds me it reminds me of one of my favorite movies of all time, and maybe this is why it's one of my favorite movies of all time. But there's an old Katharine Hepburn, Spencer Tracy movie called Desk Set,
mm,
where Katharine Hepburn plays the head research librarian at basically what is NBC or CBS. Back when they used to have there was no internet, so you would have to call a research librarian and say, "I have this question. What is this thing about this island? Because I think I heard this thing at once. Could you tell me the fact?" And they would
yeah.
either know where to look to find the fact or just know the fact and tell you. And so it's the story about this group of reference librarians who find out that they're bringing a computer into their workplace. And it's one of those big ones that takes an entire room and is you have to feed the punch cards into because of the time period. But
Mm,
it was this question, the whole thing is a question of, are we going to lose our jobs because this computer is coming in?
yeah.
And by the end they realize, oh no, this computer can't think for itself. Like we still have to be the ones thinking.
Mhm.
It's just a useful tool to help our job be easier for us, so we don't have to physically remember what word number on which line of which book this poem happens on.
Yeah.
And I think that is going to ultimately be where we find generative AI is on the spectrum of tool that can be used, but not the end product. It's not going to replace humans. We still have to have a brain that thinks and puts pieces together.
I think like that's kind of the thing with like that's why I was like it's going to get worse before it gets better. You know what I mean? Like I think unfortunately we are as a society going to have to learn the very hard lesson of like no, you can't actually like lay off your entire like team of people and replace it with AI. I mean, we're kind of, I feel like to a certain extent already kind of seeing consequences in real
Yeah.
time. 'Cause, like there was like this guy who won like a lawsuit. I think it was maybe Air Canada where they had like an AI chatbot. And like the chatbot literally hallucinated like a bereavement leave policy that didn't exist and had told him like, yes, you can go on this flight and we will compensate you for bereavement leave, like for like bereavement or whatever. And then he like goes to Air Canada like afterwards and is like, "Hey, like submitting my like flight info and all this stuff." And they were like, "No, that's not a policy. Like that's not real." And he was like, well, your chatbot told me, and so I think like the legal ramifications are going to get very funny.
Yeah.
Like I think we're in the fuck around and find out stage of like AI where I
Yeah.
think there's going to be a huge wall that gets hit where companies are like, oh shit, we're actually like going to be held legally liable for the stuff that this where hallucinates, right? But also like realistically, you can't have a functioning society when you're constantly laying off people and, like so that's really interesting. But yeah, seeing how it's been in academia, like I think that's kind of where I have the most concern. My concern is really not actually with artists because I think artists are fundamentally creative people and they'll always find cool ways to innovate,
Mm.
experiment, break these systems, find new ways to kind of subvert and challenge, what these technologies and tools are meant to do. But at the academic level, I think I am a bit worried, mostly for just like like this new generation of like undergrads and younger students where, you know, they're going to have to like essentially relearn how to learn to a certain extent because
Yeah.
all of this AI is being pushed on them so hard and like, it's being treated again like a solution, not as a tool, not as like a stepping stone. Yeah.
Well, and that brings us to our synthesis questions. Yay! At the end of every episode, I like to ask a series of questions to all of my guests. So don't think too hard about these, just whatever answer pops to mind, and we'll go with it. So, question number one: what is your typical executive dysfunction and or rest day activity?
Oh boy. Um I feel like I want to be better about reading on my rest days. I do really make it a point to read for fun. Whenever I'm not like in school or like caught up in work, like I make myself, I'm like, I'm not reading right now. I'm like, I'm reading no nonfiction for like the rest of the summer. So I feel like with my rest days, I always really try to read. Sometimes I'll work on like, more creative projects, but I don't know. I feel like I just like to kind of veg a little bit, but I love to just like walk around and explore, to be honest. I mean, living in New York, I love nothing more than having a day where I'm procrastinating and I just go see a movie at like 2 in the afternoon because I have the day off or, you know, I feel like I'm always trying to kind of immerse myself in different things and have different experiences, whether I'm going perfume shopping or going to like a museum. I feel like that helps me really break out of my executive dysfunction also because I'm like, I'm giving myself like, I'm stepping outside of myself for a little bit and getting immersed in a different world or in a different moment or a different sensory experience. And then when I'm like done with my rest or done with my sort of executive dysfunction, I can kind of jump back into whatever I'm in the throes of.
What is your favorite setting for working on your research?
I have a whole like home office, as you can see behind me. I don't use it. I like barely get work done, which is so funny. I like having an office, like I love having an office space, I should say, at home. Like it's nice, but also I cannot work from home. I had to work from home. Like I had like two work from home jobs during COVID. I was like fighting for my life trying to like get stuff done during the day. Like I just like end up on my couch or like I end up
Oh
like
yeah.
doing chores. So I feel like usually my favorite setting honestly is the library. Like I love the library. I have a public one near my house. Obviously when I'm in school, like I go to my school library and what I have found is I think more than anything what I like is the journey of getting there, like I feel like I'm able to set some really healthy boundaries where I'm like, okay, I'm gonna schlep however far I need to schlep to go to my like place where I want to go work, and then I'm gonna work, no distractions, no nothing. Like I'm just gonna focus. And then when I leave, like I'm done and that's it. And so yeah, libraries usually end up being the best. I know people love to work in cafes. I kind of struggle actually sometimes when I work in cafes, mostly because like people will be chatting, like people will be talking. I don't like love like having to spend, like $6 on a matcha latte to like sit there. And also like I'm a big believer that like, hey, when you're in an academic institution, you should be making the most of the resources you have available to you. So yeah, I feel like I'm usually you will catch me in a library.
What is one thing an advisor has told you that has stuck with you? And this can be good or bad.
This is not an academic advisor, but I was in a perfumery class like a couple of years ago at the Met. And our instructor, who's this really great perfumer, Michael Nordstrand, amazing guy, we're talking about the process of making perfumery. And, we're all kind of doing this really for the first time. And at one point he goes, yeah, like when you make perfume, especially when you're starting out, you are going to make mud. Like you are going to make mud it's going to be incoherent. It's not going to smell good. It's not going to smell like frankly anything because you're probably adding way too much, and like it's going to be chaotic and it's going to be mud, like it's going to be muck and whatever. But he was like, yeah, like you're going to need to make mud. You're going to need to make mud probably a few times and eventually like you will get that practice and that skill and you'll stop making mud at some point. It will become perfume, but that's part of the process. And I feel like I've really internalized that with a lot of like my writing and like creative work that I do, where I'm like, yeah, like I need to make some mud. It's not going to make sense. It's going to be really weird. People are going to be reading it being like, what is this? But like that's part of the process and that's part of the experience of like being a creative person and being a researcher.
If you could choose any other area of research, what would you choose and why?
Mm. That's a good question. Honestly, I feel like I would. Okay, this is so silly. If I wasn't like a contemporary art historian, I would probably be a medievalist. I love
Mm.
medieval art, medieval history, medieval culture. I think it's so fascinating. Such a compelling time period. Stuff going on with like literature, music, art writing. So weird, so strange. I find it so fascinating. But yeah, I think I would probably become if I could do school again, I would maybe become a medievalist, which is so
Mm.
funny because it's just, it feels so different from like everything I'm doing now, but I really do love it. It's like, that's like kind of my little like side hobby is like I love reading books about like medieval history when I'm like not working on bigger projects.
I love that medieval artists never really figured out how to paint babies or animals.
No, and it's so weird. Yeah, like okay. Yeah, like okay, The Green Knight, like the movie with Dev Patel? The
Mhm.
like okay, I love that movie because in part it feels to me like one of the most accurate representations of just how weird like medieval writing and like literature was. Like it's so strange. And you're just
Mhm.
what is going on with these characters? Like it's so different from what society is like today. That's just like so interesting. And I've been in some fun rabbit holes too on like the lives of medieval women and like gender and like what that looked like. I love like religious medieval stuff, like reliquaries and like how we just loved to like collect bones for some reason. And I don't know. I think it's all really, really cool. But yeah, medieval studies has my heart always, even if I don't do that professionally now.
Who is one other academic whose research you really admire?
Ooh. Um, Going back to Decay, a book that I constantly reference in my own research is Curated Decay by Caitlin DeSilvey. Caitlin DeSilvey, as a scholar as a whole, I think has been really, really formative for me in terms of methods about decay, thinking about landscape and culture, and how those two intersect. But in her book, Curated Decay, she writes a lot about like these really interesting ethical questions around heritage preservation. So like she's based
Mm.
out of the UK. So most of the sites she chooses are kind of like in Europe. And she talks about places ranging from like a disused kind of like historic like military site that's being reclaimed by the sea and like what does it mean to like let the sea reclaim it and not try to like actually save
Mm.
it and like how that impacts the history. She also talks about this place called Landschaft Park in Germany, where it was this huge industrial coal factory that they have converted now into a public park, but opted to actually keep a lot of the industrial sculptures, like structures,
Mm.
and turn them almost like sculptural works, but also like things you could go into and interact with. So she's been really influential, and I think a scholar that I frankly just cite like a ton in my work. I think in terms of like the more creative side of things, Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, who is an environmental humanities in the kind of English medieval space scholar. I think he's at, I want to say University of Arizona, is where he's at.
Okay.
But he had this really, really great book called Prismatic Ecologies that I remember reading my like sophomore year of undergrad. And it's called Prismatic Ecologies, Eco Theory Beyond Green. And each chapter in the book is a different piece of writing about an aspect of nature and culture and like the environment that refuses green. Like it refuses to be green. So we're talking about like how like shrimp can't like can see like UV light. And what does that mean to have like this whole range of visibility? And like thinking about like surveillance, thinking about like aquascapes and water and like blue ecology, thinking about different kinds of like desert terrain and like how we don't really talk about that. Because usually when we think about
Mm.
environmental work, it's very green, like it's very heavily green. It's
Mm.
a very specific kind of landscape. And so he's been, I think, really influential in the kind of like multi-sensory aspects of my work that I'm really interested in, where, how do we expand our definition of nature beyond just these like stereotypes or cultural norms? But also like how grappling with these landscapes can also just give us whole new perspectives on the world and on people, but also different species and, how we relate to one another.
What is a question you've never been able to answer?
Oh, God damn. That's a good question.
I like
Mm,
to stump my guests.
oh my God, questions I can never answer. Um, hmm, I have to think about this. Hmm.
I get so much joy from watching
No,
researchers be like, oh no, there's so many.
I don't even know if it's a question that I can't answer, but hilariously there are these like threads of thought that exist in like the environmental humanities world that are like rooted in like astrophysics. That
Mm.
feels perpetually beyond me. Like to the point where I'm like, even if I tried to take this on as like a research subject, I wouldn't even know like where to start. Um, I think actually I really struggle with like a lot of traditional like philosophy and
Mm.
critical theory stuff. Like I find that they provoke questions for me that I really struggle to find the answer for. And I sometimes struggle with like how philosophical material is like interpreted or talked about. Um, like I think with the questions that I can't answer, I think that's always an issue also of like communication, where I'm like,
Mm.
no, like I feel like questions like should be able to be answered in some way, even if not fully. And sometimes I feel like when I reach something unanswerable, I always look back and I reflect, like, is this genuinely a subject that is just not there yet? Like we don't fully know all the information, or is this subject maybe not being communicated in as accessible of a way as it should be? But yeah, I think astrophysics and philosophy are like the things that give me like the most grief. So we'll just say that.
That answer just made me really desperately want to know what your sign is.
I'm an Aquarius.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. And then the final question: what font do you wish you could present your research in?
Like font.
Uh huh.
Hmm. Well, I feel like, oh my God, I wrote with like Garamond. That was like the trendy like poetry font for like the
I
entire like
love Garamond.
Garamond is like so funny. But I've seen it get like memed to death on Twitter with
That's fair.
like poetry Twitter of like, yes, like all the poets are using Garamond and it's so because I'm like, they don't want to use Times New Roman. Cracks me up. I will say I'm a Times New Roman girly.
Wow.
I'm a traditionalist perhaps in that way, but I think for me it's also like when I think about like fonts and stuff and like text, what I'm always thinking about is accessibility, frankly. That's just
Mm.
like the museum, like cultural worker part of my brain. That's like the researcher part of my brain. I'm like, how do I make things like visibly legible? Because my God, sometimes when you're in these like experimental creative publishing spaces, you encounter some shit that is like truly unreadable because of the way that it's printed, weird experimental fonts, like weird color combinations where I'm like, this is hurting my head. But also like you've spaced things out in this layout so weirdly that I can't like comprehend it. Like my partner works in nightlife and I also do a little bit of dabbling in like New York City's like rave culture and nightlife. And there's kind of a running joke of like really illegible rave poster flyers where you
Oh
actually
yeah.
don't know who's performing at what time or where this is located, but it looks cool. So it's just like, okay. So yeah, I feel like I love Times New Roman for the kind of like visibility of it, the accessibility of it, I don't know, it's something very familiar and very like comforting to me. And there's something that feels like a little like cunty and official about like changing my font to be like, oh, Times New Roman. Like, yes, we have our shit together. But
Well,
yeah.
you are officially the first Times New Roman person on this podcast. So congratulations.
This feels like my like one like boomer like opinion that I have maybe where I'm like,
It's
no, I
okay. We're allowed to have our opinions.
oh my
Well,
gosh.
thank you so very much. I really appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to talk to me. This has been truly an amazing conversation.
No, I'm glad it was really fun to speak with you and it was really cool to be able to reflect. I feel like you've caught me at a really funny turning point in my life where I'm like kind of embarking on a new chapter, but also like kind of finishing some other stuff. So it's been really cool to kind of just share more about that.
Yeah. When we will talk to you all later. Bye.
Bye.
Gosh, I loved that conversation. I really hope you did too. It was so eye opening to me, and being able to look at topics in completely new ways. I frequent museums. Museums are some of my favorite things, and art galleries are some of my favorite things to visit. And I've just never considered sculpture and landscapes in this way before, especially through the lens of decay and how the environment breaks down these artworks. So yeah, I really hope that this conversation was as enlightening to you as it was to me, and a huge, huge thank you to Ellie for taking time out of their schedule and talking to me. I really appreciated it. Um, if you would like to submit a question to a future podcast, feel free to find us on Instagram at hypothesispod, or you can send us an email at podcasthypothesis@gmail.com. That email address again is podcasthypothesis@gmail.com. You can also submit a verbal question to us on SpeakPipe. Just keep it brief. Don't make it too long, and make sure that you're in a relatively quiet area. But you can do that at speakpipe.com/hypothesispodcast. That's speakpipe.com/hypothesispodcast. You can also find all of the articles discussed in the podcast today on my Substack. That's iramcintosh.substack.com. Eventually we'll also start getting the transcripts up there. We're working on that. So please be patient. It's just me doing all of this, so it takes a little bit of time, but that will be coming in the future. But you can find the video, the audio, and all of the articles that we discussed on the Substack. That's iramcintosh.substack.com. Please follow all of our socials. You can find Hypothesis on Instagram, like I said, at hypothesispod. You can also find myself on Instagram at Ira A. McIntosh. That's Ira A. McIntosh. And then you can find me as well on TikTok at The Gay Ethnographer. That's my TikTok handle again, is at The Gay Ethnographer. So please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast with your friends. I want to open up the floodgates of education for everyone and get everyone curious and interested in learning new things. And the only way we can do that is if you share the podcast with your friends and you subscribe and boost us in the ratings, because that's how Apple and Spotify suggest this podcast to new people, is only if people are rating, reviewing, and subscribing. So please take your role in this community seriously, because I would love to get as many people hearing this as possible. So yeah, let's fight misinformation together. Thank you for listening, and go read a book.